Hello, everyone. We'll begin now, just to make sure we have time to address all of the different topics. Anyway, the webinar will be registered, so you will be able to access to it in the replay. So just to begin, we will have a quick round of introduction of the panelists, and then we'll introduce to you BIA-GBS, the GBS, and also we'll talk about Article 29 and the TNFD pilots. I will let maybe Julie to introduce herself with Violette, and then I will continue.
Yes. Hello, my name is Julie. I work at CDC Biodiversité on the development of the BIA-GBS platform, and I'm here with also Violette Pradère from CDC Biodiversité.
And on my side, so I'm Melissa Perez. I'm head of sales and business development at Carbon4 Finance, and we are really happy to be together today to discuss about this topic. We can go on the next slide. So as you see, we are two different firms, so CDC Biodiversity and Carbon4 Finance, and we partner to propose to our clients the best databases on biodiversity. Carbon4 Finance is a historical actor on a database, and we provide climate data since 2016. And CDC Biodiversity is a strong actor on biodiversity. And we say that we celebrate together our 30th birthday of expertise because we both have 15 years of expertise on scientific topics such as climate and biodiversity. The reason why we work together is because we share the same values about the fact that we want to be open source, to share the methodology, and to make sure that the clients always have an answer about why, how the data was built. And we recognize this kind of value with CDC Biodiversity. So this is the reason why we co-construct together the databases called BIA-GBS, and the GBS is coming from the methodology called the Global Biodiversity Score from CDC Biodiversity. So just to continue, and before we enter on the methodological part, as a summary, we are able together to propose you solutions for all the type of asset classes that you might have on your institution, from listed corporate to the corporate itself. And we also cover sovereign bond, green bond, loans, private equity, and real estate for climate with carbon impacts analytics and the climate risk impact screening. And I will let Julie explain for biodiversity.
Yes, for biodiversity, the Global Biodiversity Score, so the GBS, allows to compute the biodiversity footprint of different entities and different types of asset classes. And so you can see it at the bottom of the slide. So at the bottom left, you have the BIA-GBS database. And then you can see that we also cover other types of asset classes.
Perfect. I will let Julie introduce to you the GBS tool, and we'll talk a bit more detail about the BIA-GBS database later.
Yes. Okay, so first about the GBS tool. So the BIA-GBS database is a database with the biodiversity footprint of listed assets. And this database uses the GBS tool to compute this biodiversity footprint. So just a brief history of the GBS. You see here that we started working on the GBS in 2015 and that the tool was first launched in 2020. And then a year later, we launched with Carbon4 Finance, the database BIA-GBS. And so now we at CDC Biodiversité, we have a full team of 20 people dedicated to the project and strong support of the Caisse des Dépôts. The GBS is strongly integrated in the biodiversity ecosystem. And so you can see here different international stakeholders such as the TNFD. We have strong links with all of them. For example, we are conducting TNFD pilots, which I will talk about a bit later in the presentation. We also are offering Article 29 reports, and we work closely with Finance for Biodiversity, the iLine project, the SBTN, etc. So as I said, the GBS is a biodiversity footprinting tool which follows the double materiality approach, meaning that it assesses both impacts and dependencies on biodiversity. And so this is, for example, this has been this double materiality approach has been adopted in France by Article 29. And so this allows to assess both the transition risks and the physical risks, so both impacts and dependencies on biodiversity. And so first, I will talk a little bit about our impact methodology. So here you have three key features of the GBS. First, the metric, which is in MSA square kilometer. Then you also have the whole value chain. So we use the concept of scopes, as in climate, to account for impacts along the value chain. And finally, we separate between the static and dynamic impacts, which is really specific for biodiversity impacts. So I will talk a little bit more about that later. So first about the metric used in the GBS and so in the database BIA-GBS is the MSA square kilometer, which is a multiplication between biodiversity loss in MSA and the impacted surface in square kilometer. So as you can see on the left, the MSA represents the integrity of ecosystems. So MSA of 100% is a totally undisturbed ecosystem with 100% of remaining biodiversity. So for example, a forest, an undisturbed pasture, etc. And on the contrary, an MSA of 0% is a totally disturbed ecosystem with no remaining biodiversity. So by multiplying this biodiversity loss in MSA by the surface, we obtain an impact in MSA square kilometer, and an impact of 1 MSA square kilometer is equivalent to the destruction of 1 square kilometer of undisturbed natural ecosystem. So to compute the impact on the entire value chain, we use the concept of scopes. It's the same concept as for carbon footprinting. So I will not talk about it too much, but we distinguish between scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 upstream, and scope 3 downstream. And finally, on the key features, the GBS distinguishes between the static impact and the dynamic impact. And so this is really specific to biodiversity footprinting. We do this because on biodiversity, we have already crossed the biodiversity planetary boundary, meaning that reducing our future impacts will not be enough to come back to the safe operating space. So we need to account differently between the new impacts that we have every year, but also our historical impacts. And so this is really this concept. First, we have the static impact, which is the cumulative negative impact. And so meaning the historical impact of a company or a portfolio, for example. And then we have the dynamic impact, which is the new impact during the assessed period. So traditionally, it's 1 year. And so just a quick comparison with carbon, you will always assess the GHG emissions during the year of assessment. And so that's a dynamic impact. And the static impact would be the historical emissions of the company. And finally, because it's not possible to directly measure the impact on biodiversity in MSA square kilometer, this would require exhaustive ecological surveys. We actually measure pressures on biodiversity by companies or portfolios, and we convert these pressures into impacts using the GloBio model. And you can see here the different pressures covered by the GBS, and so the different pressures available in the database BIA-GBS. So on the left, you have the different IPBES pressures, so land and sea use change, direct exploitation, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species. You can see here that we do not yet cover the invasive alien species. And you also have the different ecosystems that we cover. So for now, we cover terrestrial and freshwater freshwater ecosystems and not yet marine ecosystems due to a lack of existing methodology. But you can see here the different pressures that we consider. So you have, for example, land use, wetland conversion, climate change, etc. And for this part, I'm going to leave Melissa present it.
Thank you. So we are going to use the GBS functioning to be able to have impacts on the databases. So the global idea is to be able to measure the impact of corporate and sovereign in MSA kilometer square. But in order to do it, we need some data. So the way the GBS is functioning is that at the entry of the model, you can have, for example, turnover value, and then you are going to transform this turnover using databases into commodities, and then you are going to transform it into pressure and then into impact. The idea of this slide is to take a really easy example with a company called, for example, Chicken Corp, which is doing poultry farming. And we are going to use for BIA-GBS to be able to have the type of commodities needed for the economical activity of Chicken Corp. So if you need to sell chicken, you need to feed your chicken, so you need corns. And this at this stage, you will have tons of corns produced. Then what we will have is the pressure. So in order to be able to feed your chicken with corns, you need to have a production of corn. Hence, you will have some land occupation. So it's one of the pressure that Julie described earlier. And then we'll use the model GloBio to be able to have this translation from pressures to impact. The GBS model is very flexible, so you can use the different type of data to, at the end, have the same type of metrics, so the MSA kilometer square. So if we go on the next slide, that's exactly what we are doing. With BIA-GBS, we are using this flexibility of the GBS to have some entry data from directly some databases from Carbon4 Finance. We are using two different databases from Carbon4 Finance. One is our physical risk database, so CRIS, where we already have the split between the turnover and the sector for each companies. And the other one we are using, which is very important, is our carbon impacts analytics database, which is the database with all of the scope 1, the scope 2, and the scope 3 upstream and downstream emission that will be able, that will allow us to have the pressure on climate change. The idea is that we will replace the Excel-based modelization with directly this data on climate change. At the end, we still have the results of the GBS, so everything will be expressed in terms of MSA kilometer square for the terrestrial and aquatic impact, dynamic and static. I'll let Julie explain now the dependency scores, which are very important parts of the GBS and of BIA-GBS as well.
Yeah, thank you, Melissa. So as I said earlier, with the GBS, we assess both the impacts and the dependencies on biodiversity. So this is about the dependencies. And so I will present here the methodology used by the GBS to assess dependencies on biodiversity. And so these dependencies are then available on the BIA-GBS database. So the dependency score is a score between 0% and 100%. 0% being a no known dependency and 100% being a very high dependency on ecosystem services. We assess the dependencies both for direct operations and for the supply chain. And we assess the dependency on 21 ecosystem services that you can see here at the bottom of the slide. And so we use for this the Encore model, which gives dependencies of different processes on biodiversity. And so this dependency score is then available using two different methodologies, which are complementary. First, we provide an average dependency score, which is an average dependency of a company or a portfolio on all ecosystem services. So this allows to have a global view of the dependency of your company or of your portfolio. But we also provide a critical dependency score, which represents the share of a company or a portfolio that is critically dependent on at least one ecosystem service. So this is a complementary view, which allows to flag the highest dependencies of a company or a portfolio. And so here on the bottom, you have the overall methodology of the dependencies. The idea being that we take the sector of activities of the company and the sector of activities of its value chain to obtain the upstream dependencies. And then using an in-house mapping, we map these sectors to the processes used by the Encore model. And then the Encore model gives us the dependencies of these processes. And so at the end, we have an average and a critical dependency score by company or by portfolio. So I think at the end of this part about the GBS methodology and the BIA-GBS database. So I will now let Melissa present to you how to use the database BIA-GBS.
Yes, thank you. We have a lot of time this kind of question, how the data can be used for a financial institution. So that's the kind of information we can provide to you. So if we go on the next slide, the first point is that BIA-GBS database is a database for listed assets. So the idea is that you will have directly this information within a platform where you can import and export directly your Excel file and have a portfolio view, but also as well a corporate and sovereign view. So the first way to use the platform is really to do more like a research on certain type of your portfolio, or to be able to look at some piloting. The other point, which is very important, is that all of our teams, so the research team of 25 analysts, is in direct contact with your team, so your own research team, to be able to answer all of the questions. And one way to use the GBS database is more in a way of training, I would say. So each time you see something that is intriguing you in terms of results, in terms of why this dependency score is high or low, why this impact is high or low for this or this pressure, we are here to answer your question. And that's a very important and strategic way to use the data to be able to have all together the same type of knowledge on what matters on biodiversity. So if we go on next slide, you will see some type of clients that are using the data. So for example, for some clients as a Euronext, they are using the database for index. So they built with BNP an index for structured products using the BIA-GBS databases. We have other clients, for example, Silex, which are using our climate product as well for structured product, providing scores on climate and providing alternative structured product solution with lower impact. We also have central banks using the climate data for their own portfolio, but also looking for how they can use it for more monetary purposes. And if we go more specifically on the BIA part, I will say on the next slide that we have seen, and sorry if someone look at that and they are not French, but thanks to the Article 29, we saw that there was a lot of French actors that have taken the lead during the past 2 years since we launched a BIA-GBS. And we see that a lot of actors have now access to this data. Since 2 years, they have built thematic funds, they have built indexes, they have incorporated into their annual report, into their Article 29 report. So that's something that we value a lot. And we see more and more now international actors. The latest one we have signed is ING, that have signed the biodiversity pledge and using the databases. And that's something we really encourage our international actors that have signed the pledge or who want to dig in and have a bit of a curiosity on this biodiversity topic to contact us to talk about it. The last point on the usage of the data would be the engagement part, which is the way that Vontobel is using the databases. The idea is really to take the data and specifically the impact and dependency score and have a dialogue with the company you are investing in and to say, look, I've seen that you have a huge impact. You are also at risk because some of your subsectors are very dependent on some services. That could be also a way to have a discussion with your corporates and something we can also help you with and really encourage. So if we go now on the next part of this webinar, because it's really, I would say, the period of the time where we are talking about the Article 29 of the Loi Énergie-Climat. So that's a specific regulation, a French regulation that is asking since 2 years now biodiversity metrics. So if we go on the next slide, what we see is that there are different parts of this Article 29. Some are more for the entity itself to fill, everything about more your governance, your strategy, your general approach, but some we can definitely help you with on the data part. So everything about alignment with European taxonomy, alignment with Paris Agreement, but also, of course, the biodiversity alignment and everything related to risk and specificities about climate and biodiversity risk. That's one of the reasons why we are applying the methodology of the GBS on the dependency, because dependency scores are required by the Article 29, and that's one of the metrics you can use to answer this regulation. But concretely, what we are doing, so if we go on the next slide, the idea is that if you need to have Article 29 help or production, we can help you with in a few weeks. The idea is that you can provide to us your inventory directly with an Excel file with the different ISIN and the weight of investment. It can be for fixed income, for equity. You can provide to us as well a benchmark to be able to make sure that we are benchmarking your portfolio with the benchmark of your choice. And then we will directly produce to you a report with some data analysis. And we will also explain this report. So at the end of the 4 weeks, what we do is we do a summary of the methodology. We link it with what is required by the Article 29 regulation, and we'll explain to you directly how is your portfolio performing, what can we tell about the data, how is it comparing with the benchmark. And usually a few weeks later, we have a Q&A session when you have talked about it internally with your team, and we can discuss about the results. So if we go on the next slide to conclude on this topic, there are 4 pillars on the Article 29 part. One is really the data part. So the idea is that we will really use the BIA-GBS databases to make sure that we answer what is required. The other part is the training part. So we'll spend a few hours explaining the methodology, explaining the Article 29 with your team to make sure that everything is understood and answer any question you might have. Then we will produce and deliver to you the reporting in a format of a presentation and an Excel file. And then a few weeks later, we are doing a few Q&A sessions with all of your team to make sure that every data is explained and clear for everyone. So now we are going to conclude this webinar with the TNFD pilot part, and I will let Julie complete on that part.
Yes, thank you. So as we said, CDC Biodiversité and Carbon4 Finance, we conducted TNFD pilots. So these pilots, what are TNFD pilots? The goal is to test the TNFD framework and especially the LEAP approach for financial institutions. So we conducted these pilots with 2 different financial institutions, and we conducted these pilots in partnership with UNEP-FI, so UN Environment Programme Financial Initiative. So the focus was on the sector agriculture and fisheries in Europe. And so, as I said, the objective of these pilots was to apply the LEAP approach for financial institutions, but at 2 different levels, both at company level and at portfolio level. And this allows us to study what's currently feasible, considering the different tools available, the different methodologies, etc. And finally, we reported on the main challenges and the limits of the TNFD framework directly to the TNFD. And so it was really an exercise to study the actual version of the framework, the actual LEAP approach, and how does it really fit with data available for the company and the tools on the market. So the focus of these pilots was 2 parameters. First, a portfolio of 10 companies of the sector agriculture and fisheries in Europe. And then we also selected for each portfolio a focus company for a more in-depth study and to study the differences between the LEAP approach for a company and the LEAP approach for a portfolio and a financial institution. And so this LEAP approach was conducted on the entire value chain in order to really test the approach, even if now in the TNFD framework, it's not really explicit that it needs to be conducted for the entire value chain. So here you have an overview of the LEAP approach and what we can currently do directly with BIA-GBS, what we can do using other tools, and what we can do with a little bit of methodology development. So first, the LEAP approach is separated into 4 phases. So we have the locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare. So I will start with maybe the evaluate phase, as it's really already feasible with BIA-GBS. As you can see on the slide, the evaluate phase demands the assessment of dependencies and impacts. And so that's exactly what we provide with the database BIA-GBS. So dependencies and impacts at company or portfolio level. Then if we go a little on the left, we have the locate phase, which is to locate the interface with nature. So to date, BIA-GBS provides the impact and the dependencies at portfolio levels, and therefore does not really consider the locate part. So for this phase, it would be necessary to use asset level databases and to just work with these asset level databases and the database BIA-GBS. For the assess phase, we worked on different methodologies to be able to assess the risks and dependencies, the risks on biodiversity. So the A4 step is partially feasible and under development, and I will talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. And finally, we have the prepare phase to set targets, report, etc. And we are currently working on it. And we worked on it for the pilot, and that's it. So here on the slide, you have the overall methodology that we used for each phase. So, and the parameter considered, so were we able to apply it at company or portfolio level, etc. So first, for the locate phase, we only applied this phase at company level, as it does not really apply at portfolio level because it would be really, really complicated to locate each asset of each company of the entire portfolio. And so for this first pilot, we used annual reports and public data available on the focus companies. And then we used the IBAT tool to study the different sites and so study that there are protected areas, KBAs, the IUCN Red List, etc. And so this allowed us to have a location of impacts and some location of the impacts. And then for the evaluate phase, as I said before, it's completely feasible with the BIA-GBS database, meaning that we were able to apply it both at company and portfolio level. And so we assessed the dependencies and the impacts of the company of the portfolio on biodiversity. And for this, we used the database BIA-GBS with a bottom-up approach, which we are currently developing. So earlier, Melissa presented you with the data that we use as an input of the database BIA-GBS. And so for now, we use financial data from the CRIS database and GHG data from the CIA database. And so, but for these pilots, we developed a bottom-up approach, meaning that instead of financial data, we used commodities data, so inventories of final products. And so we developed this module for the agriculture and agri-food sector. Then on the assess phase, for these first pilots, we applied it only at company level. So we did a qualitative assessment risk by risk of both the transition risks and the physical risks. And then we developed, so we did a biodiversity stress test to assess globally the physical and the transition risk at company level. So not an evaluation risk by risk, but really at company level, an estimation of the physical and transition risks. And so, yes, we did this using a methodology that we developed for these pilots and for other projects that we have. And so it was really interesting. And finally, for the prepare phase, we applied it at portfolio level, and we use all kinds of results from the first 3 phases. And just quickly, as an example, you can see here an example of results that you can obtain with the BIA-GBS database. So the impacts are provided by first ecosystem and accounting category, meaning there is a separation, a distinction between the terrestrial and the aquatic impact, but also between the static and the dynamic impact, which is really important for biodiversity. You can also have so the impacts by scope, as you can see on the left, so between the upstream scope 3, scope 1, scope 2, etc. You have also the impact by pressure. So here in this example, it's between climate change and land use. And finally, when using the bottom-up approach, we were able to distinguish the impacts by product. So by final product, you can see here we have, for example, milk, drinks, infant food, etc. And so it's a really granular approach to really be able to have the impact by ecosystem, accounting category, scope, pressure, and product. And of course, you also have the overall impact of a company or a portfolio. And so this was an example of results that we had for the evaluate phase, but this was, of course, applied to all ecosystems and also to both company and portfolio level. And finally, on this topic, if TNFD pilot is something that is interesting for you, we are currently finishing the first round of pilots. So and we are looking to start a second round of pilots, also with CDC Biodiversité, Carbon4 Finance, and UNEP-FI. And so here, these first pilots were really an overall overview of the LEAP approach. And here we would like to go a little bit more in depth on some subjects, which are, we think, really interesting for both for us, but also for the TNFD and for financial institutions. So you can see here an example of subjects that we have in mind. So on the left, on the LEAP approach, going a little bit further with banking activities, but also see how can the regulatory context influence the nature-related risks disclosure. We would also like to work on private equity for the LEAP approach, and finally going a little further both on the locate phase, so the L locate phase, and the evaluate phase. And we also would like to work on nature scenarios. So as I said, we conducted a biodiversity stress test for these pilots, but we would like to go further by measuring the financial value for physical and transition risks and using so nature scenarios. And we would also have to measure the alignment of portfolio and issuers. And so finally, the last subject we would like to work on would be climate and nature nexus. So with pilots, you can see here you have various examples of subjects, so data collected for climate change related risk. Is it sufficient to measure biodiversity related risks? So analysis of synergies and antagonisms, etc., etc. So these are some of our ideas for future TNFD pilots, but don't hesitate if you have an idea, if you want to work on something, etc., to contact us. And so I think that's the end of our presentation. Maybe, I don't know if you have some questions, don't hesitate to put them in the Q&A, but I think we already answered some questions. Maybe you want to add something, Melissa? I don't know.
No, thank you very much, Julie. I think that what you can keep in mind is that the GBS is a methodology that has been created by CDC Biodiversity. We are using it to co-construct together a database called BIA-GBS. This database can be used by all types of financial actors. And specifically today, we talked about two use cases, one on more reporting purposes for Article 29 and transparency exercise, and the other one, which is more, I would say, almost a research part with a TNFD pilot co-conducted by CDC Biodiversity and Carbon4 Finance.